So I think we need one more. No, I think we have a quorum at this point.
We're good. We're good. I think, yeah. You want to start going through the, can I call this meeting to order?
I think you can. Yep.
And would you start taking us through the agenda, please?
Yeah. Yeah. So the first item on the agenda is the treasurer's report. I don't know if we're going to see Naheem. I don't think he RSVP'd. Edward did. But Doug, do you want to give us a very quick summary of where we are for this fiscal year, and then we'll talk about the budget?
Yes. So it's going to be quick. We had very few moving parts for the month of April. I'm going to say our projections for our state aid per pupil were on target. Right now, year to date, we are at $7 million. We're projecting $8.4 million. We received our May and June payments, and they are right in line, slightly maybe $4,000 over our projected amount. So we're good. There's been no other adjustments to our revenues at all. So there's nothing to talk about with revenue. So I'm going to jump down to expenditure. A personnel line, year to date, we're saving, or we have a surplus of $198,000. That included, as I say, month over month, some vacancies that haven't been filled, some individuals who went out on maternity leave, just variation of a combination of those sorts of things. And right now, we're projecting a surplus of $175,000, although we are at 198, just being conservative. There was really no other adjustments to or no other highlights to the expenditure report. What I would like to point out is if we take a look at our statement of financial position, we will see an increase from February to April of roughly about $75,000. That is the purchase of our laptops that we purchased for the students. We started out in February around $552,000. We're ending at $627,000. It's just the increase of the Chromebooks. We're net 30, so that means we pay bills in under 30 days. So normally we're under $100,000. We hover somewhere around $70,000 is give or take, just the timing of bills going out. For the last 2 months, which was March and April for this report, payments were slow going out because we wanted to make sure that we had cash on hand and make sure that we were getting all our cash coming in from the state. So for that, we let our accounts payable or our liabilities go up. So we were at 141. Next report, we should see that decrease because we started getting our money from the state. Therefore, since we had money from the state, we pushed money out. That's the Treasury report. Any questions, comments, or concerns?
Looks pretty good.
Thank you. And I would like to just conclude by saying this is, month over month, I try to do a hard close, which is have all the bills in, very few estimates. Here, because I'm not on site at the school, I do make a run occasionally. So there may be some numbers that slightly change because there could just be bills that I'm unaware of that are at the school. And, it could change the numbers slightly, but I don't see any more worst case scenario, more than 20 grand, if that. But I'm thinking somewhere around, $3,000–4,000. That's it.
Okay.
What's next?
There's one more thing to mention here before we talk about next year's budget, and that is the additional per pupil that's coming in the month of June. So we expect around $100,000, and we are going to be using that to fill in some of the extra costs associated with the remote learning. That includes some of the Chromebooks, the capital expense, but also summer school costs. So that is not reflected in this budget because we never really know if it's coming. It's been promised. It's come every year the last few years, and the promises are ending. So this is the last year we'll get this supplemental funding. And just as a reminder, we get this money because the state legislature recognizes that it has shortchanged charters over the years, and since the financial crisis 10 years ago. And it's a way of kind of recouping some of the resources that we were missing. Those days are over now that the pandemic has hit and there's a new financial crisis. So we're back to being, uncompensated for being so far behind the district, what we get per pupil. So with that, let's talk about next year's budget. Edward, do you want to bridge us between last year's financials and this coming year's budget, or do you want me or Doug to take that away?
You guys can start, and then I'll comment when you do.
So we discussed this budget at the last call. It hasn't changed at all. For board members in your packet, it's on page 4, and I'm going to share my screen so you can see it if you're on the call. The numbers here aren't really that interesting. They're just a bunch of numbers, but the story behind it is, what are we assuming? What are we preparing for in terms of the restrained spending that we know will have to happen because of the coronavirus? And what risks are we taking on or choosing to take on? Because everything at this point is a risk. Nothing is safe fiscally. The state has told us that they can't guarantee that the per pupil will stay what it is. The per pupil was released this past week, and I think it was exactly the number that was in our budget, $16,124. Is that right, Doug? Which is a little bit of an increase from last year. Or is it a flat number from last year? It's flat.
Sorry. No, actually, we're $1 off. It's 123, I believe, and we were getting 16,150, so it's down.
Okay, so it's down a little bit. Essentially, it's flat. It's like a rounding error from being flat. The issue that we've been debating is what happens if the state does enact a catastrophic cut to the budget, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, what those chances look like and what that process looks like, and how should we prepare for that eventuality by making plans for an austerity period, and how should we prepare by being proactive with this budget right now. So I want to talk about those two things, and then turn it over to Doug, Edward, and others on the team who can fill in any more details. What is the likelihood that there will be a massive cut? We don't know what the likelihood is. The situation is that the state has a projected $60 billion shortfall. That's like a third of the state budget, so that's a little frightening. I might be a little off on my numbers, but I think that's right. This is all due to the lack of tax receipts because of the pandemic. Every state's going through this in some form. And the governor is looking for Congress to fill in that with a relief package, which is being debated right now in Congress and hasn't really gone anywhere, but could happen. The state put in place 3 review periods for next year's budget. The state budget passed April 1st. April 1st to April 30th is the first review period. And the idea was at the end of that month, they would look at the numbers and see whether a big change has to happen. And then there's a second review period. We're in it now, May 1st through June 30th. And again, at the end of that period, that's a check where they might say, okay, we're slashing the budget. And then the second half of this calendar year, July 1st to December 31st, is the third review period. So any of these 3 times, we're at risk of having this slash hit and tell us 16,124 was your per pupil, but not anymore. Now it's going to be 10,000 or 12,000 or whatever. So the odds of that happening aren't clear. With the guidance that we've gotten from the state association is that this is potentially real, but it's at this stage looks like PR by the governor to try and pressure or lobbying to pressure Congress. Nobody wants to see schools and hospitals get money cut, which is the two of the big areas in the chopping block. So we don't know. The first period has passed, and they keep delaying announcements on any changes that are going to be made. So they're now talking about at the end of June, making an announcement for the first period, which ended April 30th. So it's clear that nobody in Albany wants to make these cuts. So it's a last resort. So we can talk about that.
If I might, for a moment,
Go ahead, Pete.
I have a friend that's on the board of CUNY, and they've been told, if I understand him correctly, that they're facing a 20% cut in support from the state. Now, I know that's higher education, it's not elementary education, it's a different area, but it sounds pretty startling to me that the elementary schools would be able to escape this if the higher ed is taking a hit like that.
So what we're doing is we're preparing for a 20% cut. We're not assuming a 20% cut.
Okay.
If we assume a 20% cut, we might make decisions that might not be able to be reversed. And then if the best case scenario happens, we're messed with.
Okay.
When we hear official word, I don't think that CUNY's gotten an official word that they've gotten a 20% cut, because that would have happened, would have been public, information. They probably got the same information we did, which is get yourself ready. There may be a 20% cut coming, so prepare for it.
Okay.
That's the second conversation we're having. That's not what this budget is. This budget is the best case scenario right now, which is flat per pupil. And we've cut it down, not quite to the bone, but we've made some austerity cuts to expenses. And we have generally kept the staff intact. And we haven't cut positions, we haven't cut salaries. Once we hear news of a 20% cut, everything's on the chopping block. There's nothing that is potentially, untouched, because you're talking about $1.7 million, and we can't sustain that. So let me first quickly go through the assumptions that we made for this budget, and then come back to the austerity planning. First thing is enrollment is key. We need strong enrollment for this budget to work. If it's not strong, then we have other issues unrelated to the pandemic. So that's a big focus of my time and of our team's work this spring and summer. We have made some staffing changes. We've added some positions that we've had to because of expansion. It is our last year of expansion. We are helped by one more year of expanding and adding students. This is our last year of adding students. We'll have a full-size 5th grade now, K-5. K-5 cohorts will all be 50% larger than they were 6 years ago. And one of the big debates we've had is salaries and benefits. And we made the decision a while back to move forward with our typical increase that we give to all returning staff. We did that as a vote of confidence for our team. We said that if catastrophic things happen, then we may have to reverse that decision, but we're trying to avoid that at all costs, because we want to keep our staff happy and compensated and rewarded. Some schools have gone ahead and cut budgets, cut salaries for next year. They've cut new position, they've frozen hiring, they've kind of combined positions, they've even reneged on offer letters they already distributed. I think we don't have a luxury, but we do have a financial advantage right now where we have a surplus coming out of this year. I don't think that the schools that are making those cuts are operating with a surplus. I think their margins are much slimmer, and they are on shakier ground. And I just want to say one more thing about the pandemic planning, and then I'll turn it over to Doug and Edward and anybody else who wants to chime in. In the very, very worst case, 20% cut, we could sustain that and not make a single change to our budget by dipping into our reserve. We have about $3 million in the reserve that we've built over the years. And if it comes to such an emergency crisis that we have to make those decisions, that money is available to us as a board to say, we will consider this an emergency and we'll dip into that reserve so we can stay solvent and keep our program intact. I'm not saying we necessarily should do that, but that needs to be part of the mix for what is the austerity plan that we are developing now. So that's all I'm going to say, and back over to you, Doug and Edward, and anybody else to continue the conversation.
Would you want to go, Edward?
I also wanted to add that there is, in addition to the uncertainty around whether or not it happens to the state budget, there is also uncertainty about how long we have to do remote learning and what's the impact that's going to have on costs and expenses. So I do want to emphasize the preliminary nature of this budget, but that we'll keep the financial committee will stay informed, and we'll keep the board informed as well as things change. So you have anything you want to add?
Not much. I think you guys covered it on that end. Besides, our biggest advantage, I look at us and talking to other schools, our biggest advantage is through this, really, if we need to cut back, we have areas in which we can cut back, and many areas where other schools can't, you can't cut back on rent or space.
What kind of scenarios are you discussing vis-a-vis cuts?
Well, it's really early to tell.
So we're looking at the order that we would. Yeah. Hello. So the areas that we were considering is, again, as Steve said, it's early, but our office expense, like how we're spending there, in areas. So off the top of our head would be office expense. We may have to pull back the 4.3B match. And when we talked about bringing it last year, we said that would be, if we needed to, we would pull it back. So there are certain areas we haven't really went into the weeds with it, but just at a high level, we have some areas that we could scale back on to operate on, I would call it the 2020 crisis budgeting.
Yeah, right now, and if you can't hear me, let me stop sharing my screen so that I can maybe have a better internet connection. Right now, Doug and I have just combed through the budget and created a kind of a menu of potential cuts without respect to what would be, harmful or beneficial. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So that process of prioritizing, filtering, we won't get this news for another month. So we want to be very thoughtful and careful about what is on the chopping block, because even to say, oh, we'll cut X or we'll change that, that statement alone could create the kind of environment we're trying to avoid, which is anti-panic, planful, thoughtful, measured, and responsive to the needs of the community rather than just reacting to the crisis, which I think some schools have been doing, and making kind of knee-jerk decisions that are hurtful in the end. I'm not saying that anyone's overreacting, because this is clearly a major crisis, but I think we can do this in a way that is careful and thoughtful and also proactive.
You also have to make the board privy to what you're doing, though.
Yeah, so with the next round of committee meetings will include this discussion about what's on the table as emergency austerity measures.
And don't hesitate if you're getting call into meetings and what have you with finance or executive committee, whatever you deem appropriate.
Duly noted. Thank you.
I've got two questions for Doug and Edward. First is around the uptick in administrative costs. The second is how are you budgeting for expenses that DOE does not cover for physical reopening?
So I'll answer that uptick administrative costs. Most of those costs are related to, you guys can't see the breakdown, but that's where we park our insurance. So every year our insurance goes up by X percent. So it's more of a guesstimate. So that you'll see the uptick. This extra insurance we had to buy, that kind of takes the sum of it there. Now, on our last finance call, and on a separate call I had with Naheem, we lightly discussed that because at this point, we believe the DOE will cover all the expenses as they have been doing thus far. But again, we're in a new world. We're not open, so we theoretically can't think of what all the things that we need. From our finance call, I spent $1,800 buying us hand sanitizer that if in the event we're opening up, tomorrow, we have enough hand sanitizer to last us possibly 6 to 8 weeks, right? Will the DOE provide that? We don't know. So we haven't really talked in detail, but that goes with the areas in which we have to cut when we start what they cover and really let us know what those students can and will be. So we just haven't had it in detail.
Got it. All right. And then in terms of revenue assumptions, I can tell you unequivocally that keeping the goal at 170 for contributions, you could see as much as a 40% decrease. And so, I mean, it's not the largest ticket item by any stretch of the imagination, but it is something that we do have to keep in mind.
If historically most of our money have come from, Josh, help me out real quick. What's the grant that we got for the after school?
Sonoma Shapiro. So this year, it's 125 altogether, but it's 75 this year and 50 next year.
So I mean, assuming that comes in, we're working on another $100,000. So in a perfect world, we should be able to blow that out easily. But I think the $100,000 is doable. We never, for the most part, we have always hit the contribution goal. And, but we don't aim for anything outside of what we kind of assume that we're going to get. So we got 75 of it, assuming it comes in.
Yeah, I think there's so much uncertainty in this budget that there's no way we could, we could strip everything out of there and still be unsafe. So we're gonna, this is kind of a middle ground area, this budget, where we're building in all the things we know are known risks and challenges, and we have these fail safes for getting ready for the additional austerity needs.
If there's any concern with the budget, it would be more so around SPED, because SPED makes up a decent amount of extra funding for us. And so far we're getting paid for our SPED students. We don't know if, what next year looks like. If we're doing remote learning, like how does it change, if change at all? So that's a concern from that area, because again, most of our money comes from the state, our per pupil funding. So that's gen ed and our SPED population. So changes to IEPs and what's mandated ultimately can change the large part of the budget. At this point, we're receiving the money, and we're holding steadfast that will continue in FY21.
So let's talk about this process for a moment. I'd like us to vote on the budget today so that we can have a budget in hand, and we could always undo this and adopt a new budget if the circumstances change, which obviously they may. But we need to have something on file and be prepared for the next school year. And the due date with our authorizers June 30th. So nobody wants to wait till June to approve the budget. So I guess if there's any like kind of outstanding concerns about this draft, raise them now.
I think it.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Voika. I'm just looking at the 21 side. The projection is 8.3 million and 16,124 per pupil, but that is assuming over 500 students. Is that correct?
So it's broken down in two ways. We are projecting 504 students, right? And for my K through 5, we're looking at filling 95% of those seats because our pre-K program is paid at a different dollar amount. So you subtract that out. So we're looking at filling K through 5 seats, which will be 445 students. And then for our pre-K, which we have always been able to fill and have extra students in it, 1 or 2, that's 36. So the budget is based on 445 K through 5 and 36 pre-Ks.
Does that include the special education dollars, Doug, that line that she's looking at?
I don't know exactly. I think she's looking at it. Yeah. And for our SPED students, we're doing, if we take the average of the two, because it's a different dollar amount, it's about 62 SPED students.
So so when I divide the 16 into the 8.3, I'm getting 519 students. But this, and I see that you're projecting 400 and, I'm sorry, I'm doing this by phone, so I can't keep switching screens. 498, I believe, or 485 students.
No, so they're different dollar amounts. So if you're trying to take the total of the 435 and the 36, you won't get the same dollar amount because the pre-K students are paid at 10,122.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think my concern is that we may not get the enrollment or don't have the enrollment to cover that much. That's my concern. So I would ask you guys to think about that.
I think that's the biggest risk in this budget. It's bigger than the chances that the per pupil will decrease. Because I think there are powerful forces aligned to support the per pupil number staying where it is, but there's nobody but us aligned to support our enrollment. So that's a major focus.
That's your next subject, right?
Yep.
And if I may jump in, the math that you're trying to do, it's missing the numbers.
I think he's the special education numbers. Yeah.
Waika, you still there? No?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
I'm sorry. I'm having trouble with both my computer and my phone. I'm sorry. I can hear you.
So I'll just say it again. When you were doing the math, the numbers that you did, it's also there's inside. It's more detailed. That's just the overview of the budget. So there's the 445 for at the 16,124, and then it's 60 SPED students at 19,049, and then an additional 5 SPED students at 10,339.
Right.
And I
understand that.
That's how we got the 8.3.
Right. I understand that. I'm just concerned about if we have a drop in enrollment, or if they say that, since you don't have, 95% attendance, we're going to cut some of that money. So I'm wondering what would happen to the budget if we lost some of the per pupil funding based on enrollment or attendance.
Well, the driving force of the budget is the per pupil, for the most part. So, if we have a decrease in enrollment, which we've had 2 years ago, different climate, we were able to still weather. Bless you.
Thank you. Sorry, guys.
Impressive.
Wear your mask. you know, to go back to areas that we can cut without having it affect the staff, to hopefully make up, not hopefully, that will make up the difference. And then we also have our reserve that we could dip in to cover it until we get to, you know, the next fiscal year, where hopefully things would be normal.
Anyhow, Steve, do you think elaborating on the status of recruitment right now would help clarify things with WOICA?
Elaborating on recruitment? Yeah, I think so. Should we do that before voting on the budget, do you think?
Yes,
Yeah,
totally.
yes, I think so.
Okay, so if you turn to the dashboard in the board packet, which is, I'll share that as well, page 6. We are focusing on converting the students who are in our pipeline to securing seats. Because what happens every year is we admit more students than we can fit, and we see many of them go to other schools. I think this has been the most communicative campaign we've had in years to be in touch with these families and kind of push the uniform deadline. There's a deadline for uniforms tomorrow. So we're seeing more uniforms being bought. The numbers that you see here are projections based on what steps parents have taken so far. I'm definitely concerned about the numbers because they do not predict right now, if the baseball season ended today, we would be in the playoffs. They don't predict that we would meet our enrollment targets. They predict 90-something vacancies, which is very similar to where we were last year at this time. And I'll remind you that last year we recovered and we ended up with beginning the year with full enrollment. And our per pupil, including the special ed numbers, were way above what was in the budget. So we're in a similar place to where we were a year ago, and that is both comfort because we're not seeing the numbers, the system tell us that enrollment's going to drop precipitously, but it's cold comfort because we want to be ahead right now and not trying to play catch up. So a couple of things about these numbers that are conservative. One is the re-enrollment rate is pegged at a higher level of attrition than we saw last year. I believe the final number is around 12%, and this figures something closer to 8%. I'll let Alejandro in a minute talk about how the re-enrollment tracker is coming along, because we are doing a massive project to get everybody to commit to next year or tell us that they're moving. The other way it's conservative is we have a lot more families in here than the numbers indicate, because again, if they all show up, then we're over full. And the way we tell that is through uniforms. So I'm just going to mention one intervention we've done this past couple weeks about uniforms, and then I'll ask Alejandro to fill in more details. We were worried, began at the executive committee discussion, that families would be less inclined to buy uniforms right now. Number one, because of financial concerns. We know that the COVID has hit hardest in the neighborhoods where our kids are coming from, which has caused a number of issues in our community, but uniform purchasing is one of them because families have less money. Another issue is if we continue remote learning in the fall, then why would anybody want to buy a uniform? Their kid might even grow out of the uniform before we get back together, let's say in January or 2021. So we've put in a couple of fail-safes. We've been more assertive and aggressive with communicating to families that we will not let finances stand in the way. So we'll forgive any financial hardship, and we'll cut the cost down to almost zero, number one. And number two is we'll do a free exchange for a higher uniform size for new families until we're back together and we need to wear uniforms full time. So I think that is beginning to show some fruit this week. The numbers have been, people have been buying uniforms, but the campaign of being in closer contact and basically marketing our school first to the families that already said they're interested, so that we can stand out from the other schools, showing off the wonderful work our teachers are doing, because it is outstanding, and it does compare favorably what most families are experiencing in other schools. So we can capture those kids and bring them in. And then also all the other social media and community-based stuff that we've been planning and talking about as well. So Alejandro, let me turn it over to you to fill in any details that I missed, and then we can come back and work on the budget.
Steve, you should also mention summer learning.
Yeah, that's part of the mix of ways we're trying to bring families into the fold sooner and more aggressively than we have in the past.
All right, good morning, everyone. Let me start off with re-enrollment. I think, Steve, that was the first thing you pinged over to me. Re-enrollment, we started officially on, I think, on the 13th of May. And tomorrow, the 29th, is the last day. We're looking at this point, I'm looking at our tracker here, close to, I think, 70% of our student body has responded already, with some folks just holding out at this point, and the operations team doing some final legwork for the last 2 days to try to close that gap. But for the most part, we're set, we were anticipating potentially that either families would stay put or we'd see some families leave the city. It doesn't look like there are a ton of families at this point that are new that are leaving the city, but there were a few that we knew about earlier on, so it's unrelated to the current pandemic. So we're all in all probably expecting a very solid retention rate with very few people leaving us for other schools. The only instances that we've seen so far are ones where the younger sibling is joining a sibling that's already at a different school, whether it be like Promise Academy or Success. So by the end of this week, we'll be done with our first wave of calls. Next week will be dedicated to what we're calling escalation calls. So any families who are undecided for a reason, someone who has a good relationship with that student, will go ahead and reach out and get to the crux of the issue to help convert that. And anyone who at this point looks like they're not returning and it's because they were dissatisfied, which is a very small at this point, I'll get a phone call from the assistant principal to get to the heart of it is they feel like they want to move on. So our goal is to try to get to as close to 100% as possible. We expect to have at least pretty much 95 to 98% clarity by the end of next week once we do the escalation calls. So we'll have a pretty solid idea of where we're at by that point. On the recruitment side, the whole goal, the idea behind the touch points at this point was to give every family an account manager, so providing a sort of sales experience in that sense. So someone who is going to reach out and be your point person from the beginning of the experience. So this person is helping broker conversations with Ms. Rabani, our manager of special education services, or answering questions on our enrollment calls. There, any sort of issue related to the process, that person is serving as direct contact, which I think provides a much more welcoming and warm experience, especially in a time where perhaps families are feeling overwhelmed with the technology and a lack of touch point. So that's been the case. We've done digital enrollment hours every week. Our first week was really positive. We had 2 families, both those families completed every single step. Last week, we didn't really get many people on the call, but this week we have a few people that RSVP'd, so we hopefully will expect that same uptick. And we have a decent amount of siblings in this class, and most of those have already said yes in the re-enrollment tracker, so we are making assumptions about their willingness to bring the student who's applying. And so that's also been helpful to understand what some of those classes may look like. On the recruitment side, we're continuing to try to push on social media. We have a few ads running across the different platforms. I think part of the work that I'll need to do, just seeing where the numbers are at, is trying to be as dynamic as possible. So I've already emailed a few peers at other schools to see what other ways that we can be dynamic with our recruitment approach. And we'll be convening a recruitment team of members within our school starting next Wednesday in the afternoon. I don't know, Steve, is there anything else that I should touch on?
No, I think you hit it. I mean, the story is that we're trying to pull all the stops out And there's a lot of detail that we haven't mentioned that, we could spend hours on in terms of trying to give the experience to families that we haven't seen them have in the past at our school.
Steve, can you give maybe 20 seconds as to sort of the intersection of all of this in special education? Just because I'm trying to get a sense of the extent we don't reopen in the way that we would have anticipated, how this affects special education re-enrollment projections, and then also how the per pupil funding is affected, just in terms of sort of the intersection between the services that our special education students typically receive and what that would look like to the extent, number one, we would be remote, and then number two, to the extent that would be the case, how that would change per pupil funding.
Well, the mix of ICT students is a significant part of the budget because our budget assumes co-teaching in almost every class. So that we need the ICT funding. So if we lose special ed kids, that's a huge impact on the budget. At the same time, I don't see greater risk in that because I think what we're offering is really robust. Like I said earlier, it's true for special education students as well as general education students. Like we pushed hard to, and Ms. Rabani, who's not in this call, but is our coordinator for all things special education and works with Margaret on those things, has been extraordinarily diligent and kept the ball rolling even in the remote setting. So none of the IEP processes have dropped off because of the remote setting. She's made all these meetings happen with the CSE and had IEPs on schedule and so on. All the related services have been scheduled and happening. I mean, she did all that work to make it happen. So I think that on balance, our special education families have had a better experience at our school than they would have had at a different school. So I don't think that the pandemic introduces greater risk for that population than anybody else. In fact, I think it might work in our favor because we put so much resources and time into working with IEPs. Do you agree, Margaret?
Yeah, and in terms of integrated co-teaching and students receiving specialized services in their classrooms, the teachers have been working really hard to incorporate into their lesson designs and the intervention blocks that we have to do more specialized small group instruction with kids with IEPs as well. I was just on a Zoom yesterday. The collaborative, the New York City Charter Center Collaborative, we have a strong partnership with them, and there were over 100 people from various schools on a Zoom yesterday to talk about this very thing in terms of interventions, in terms of special ed, what's on people's minds, what are some best practices that people have been able to accomplish virtually, both with related services and ICT, what's on people's minds in terms of reopening and what that would look like with a blended model, brick and mortar, et cetera. Everybody's in the same place in terms of really trying to figure out how this can best work. And we still need more clarity. And I know that the state, the collaborative, we have all of these different partners behind the scenes trying to figure out what the policies may be. There's still a question of they allowed virtual services for special education students. That's not necessarily something that has been extended to the fall beyond brick and mortar. So there's another wave and iteration of that also having to happen and what the guardrails will be for that. So, but we're entrenched in those conversations. We'll build that into our reopening plans and scenarios of what that has to look like and make sure that we're communicating that with families.
Thank you.
So without sounding like a used car salesman, Margaret and I do have to cycle off at 9:30. We have a family presentation for our youngest child for her pre-K class. And I would like to call for a vote on the budget. I don't know if that's premature or not, Pete. I think
I agree with you. Voika, do you have further questions?
No, no. It's okay. I don't have any more questions.
I'll preface this by saying I think, as Steve made clear, this is a formal vote on this budget. but this is a very malleable situation. The budget has been made with only the knowledge we have from the past, and we don't know what the future holds. So I think we can vote. I move that we vote on the budget now, and I will support the budget, knowing that as the situation unfolds, it can be amply and precisely modified. So I move that we approve the budget as presented. Do I have a second?
I second that.
All in favor? I guess we have to vote individually on this, right? Because we can't do raise our hands and stuff. We'll vote individually. I vote aye. Edward?
I vote aye.
Boyka?
Aye.
Is this Brandon next?
That's Brandy, yeah.
Yes, I vote aye.
Laura?
Aye.
Ken?
Aye.
Allie?
Aye.
And I guess that does it, right?
For voting members,
I think so. Thank you all very much. Steve, you want to continue on with the reopening scenarios, please?
Yeah, so just quickly, not much has changed. I mean, we have a little more guidance. Our planning is taking a little bit more shape, but it hasn't really accelerated yet. We're about to dive into that in the next week. We're looking at 3 different scenarios. We're having a hard time imagining what the blended learning looks like with part of the school in the building at one time, and most or half the kids or more than half the kids doing remote learning, because the requirements to keep the building safe are so onerous. So we will do whatever it takes to keep the building safe. If we must reopen, and we understand that we may need to reopen because of state guidelines and family needs to work and so on and so forth. So that planning is still in its early stages, but it's beginning to pick up now. We are also preparing for a potential continuation of remote learning all the way through the fall, as we see how the pandemic plays out and what changes happen. So those are we mentioned a little bit earlier, like what are the protections and things we're worrying about. We've got copious guidelines from CDC at this point and from the state about what the building would have to look like for us to reopen in the fall. And the bottom line is very few kids, very little interaction, very few adults, and just being very cautious and spraying down everything all the time. So it's going to be a mess.
A lot of that hand sanitizer that we bought, right?
We're going to be showering in hand sanitizer.
But I mean, it also extends to no shared materials. So while we have community supplies in the classrooms, that's a thing of the past for the foreseeable future. So what does that look like as well? How can you have small group instruction if kids can't even be near one another? Mm-hmm. How can kids be pulled out for their services individually or in small groups if they need to stay in their classrooms? Because that's another thing that's been floated, is that kids have to remain in their classrooms even for lunch, can't leave. So what does that mean? There's a lot of things that we need to unpack as we think about these plans, and hopefully get guidance sooner rather than later, because there's a stopgap of guidance from the state.
Yeah, I know, Laura, you're probably dealing with all the same issues, but the governor, we hear, isn't going to issue a mandate about the fall until July. So that'll be fun to find out.
Laura, is that what are you getting the same vibe?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny. We spend a lot of time talking about plans for next year. Right now, I'm very engaged in conversations around the admissions policy for specialized high schools for screen schools. Mm-hmm. We've talked about attendance policies, grading policies, but there really haven't been any conversations about next year, like as far as like in person or remote. So. I think everyone's
please put in a plug that siblings go to school if they have to at the same time.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Please.
So, they've been pretty hush-hush about what they think might happen.
And we have a colleague who decided last month that their school would have certain last names Mondays and Tuesdays, and other last names Wednesdays and Thursdays, so that you could have like an even split. But then what if you have siblings with different last names in the same household?
Right.
Be different, so none of
Totally.
this stuff is, the details are voluminous and really challenging no matter what we do. And then you have the question of who's going to put their kid in the subway.
Well, that's, we've been kind of polling our parent leaders that we work with, and the general consensus, everybody's all over the page, all over the place about their opinions, but what they do agree on is that no one wants to put their kid on the subway.
Yeah. And
so how do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're also hearing that there's only one kid to a bus seat, whereas
Right.
we've been forced to have 3 kids to a bus seat.
Monica, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here.
Do you have any parent feedback on these issues?
Nothing more than what we heard when we did the town hall meeting, which was the bus was a concern. I remember a parent asking about the bus and whether there would be like some type of partition or something. But if there's one kid to a seat, I guess that's the solution to that. I think you guys, like, as far as the sibling thing, that definitely, ran across my mind. Although, thankfully they do have the same last name, so I would hope they wouldn't get caught up in a split. But I think that is a big deal. And even past siblings, sometimes you have cousins, other whatever type of family members that may all come to school together and things of that nature. But I believe that Harlem Link will do a great job as far as, if that was a thing, as far as figuring that out and knowing who needs to come together. My concern would just really be like the classroom and what that would look like. And we don't take public transportation. We do walk to school, but I can see how, getting on a bus or a train would definitely be a big concern for most parents. So, but you guys pretty much covered all that I could have thought about and things that parents expressed in our last meeting.
Steve, I hope you and your colleagues will take advantage of Monica's entree to the parents throughout this process. Thank you.
Yeah, part of the, is someone talking? Part of the planning involves ongoing feedback from families. So one thing we do not know yet, and we will know, is how many of our families will not send their kids to school under any circumstances until X, whether X is a vaccine or something along those lines, and how many families feel that they must send their kids to school in the fall because they don't have any other choices for childcare. So we have to ask those kinds of questions. We will be, and put that into the mix. And then as soon as we have like more solid plans in place, to have a small group that Monica and Val have been putting together, look at those plans and give us input.
Thank you very much.
That also falls into line, like, will the state, while we're going through this pandemic, particularly in New York City where it was hit the hardest, will there be flexibility for families to choose full-time virtual over brick and mortar? Because that could make a huge difference for some families. We have a lot of families and staff included that have been really, they live in the hardest hit zip codes for COVID in the city. And I can imagine that there would be a lot of trepidation for a lot of them to have to use public transport.
Okay. Steve, you will continue to send out your weekly report to the board, will you, please?
Will do, yes. From me and Margaret. I think we've covered most of the agenda. The only thing that we haven't talked about is committee participation by trustees. Pete, did you want to say a word about that before we wrap up?
I've written to some of you already. I just want to remind everybody that the work of the board is done mostly in the committees. That's where the vital discussions are held and the proposals for meaningful decisions occur. I hope you all attend your committee meetings even more avidly than you have in the past and participate with enthusiasm and intelligence, which you all possess. This is a really crucial period. I don't have to tell you that. And everything we can do to help Harlem Link get through this period and come out the other end a better school is going to a lot of that can start right in these committee meetings. So please participate whenever you possibly can.
Can I ask to get how to log on to those committee meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll send you the outlooks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anytime.
And I just want to end this meeting with a reminder about the stakes of the work that we're doing, because it's easy to get into our little bubbles on the screens and forget about what's happening out there in the world. My mentor in education lives in Minneapolis, and he lives 3 miles from where Mr. Floyd was killed last week. And he works with, he's a school founder, serial school founder. And I sent him Langston Hughes' poem to show some solidarity for his community. He said, "Thanks, Steve. The Black and Latino youth I mentor and mentor by and support are incredibly traumatized and angry right now. This is probably the closest thing to a clear public police murder in my experience, and just 3 miles from our house in the middle of the area where most of the students I work with live in." Social emotional supports and kind of being engaged in the fight for social justice are still happening at our school, even though we're in this remote setting. We're continuing our diversity and social justice work, even though it's been really hard to balance everything and there's so much work everyone's doing. The social workers have been taking on a massive caseload of working with students and the different needs that have come up. We mentioned how a lot of families are disproportionately affected. We've got families with multiple losses in their families. And we have essential workers who have gotten sick as parents and have recovered. So there's a hell of a lot going on. And the care and consideration of the board has been so critical, I think, to keep the community boosted. And that meeting in March when the board said, the first thing we care about is taking care of the community, has been a powerful statement. So I just wanted to end by saying that. And any last comments from anybody?
I agree. I think that work is incredibly important in terms of making sure people's health, mental health, their soul are doing well right now, and that Harlem Link plays a great role in making sure that everybody can get through this time together, because we're all in it together.
Thank you, Edward. That's a very eloquent statement. I move that we adjourn. Is there any second?
Second.
Anybody object? Thank you all for coming. Keep working hard for Harlem Link.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Have a good day.